Lyn-Genet. We're going to be starting right now, and we are live with Facebook and with you lovely folks right here. I'm excited to hear that everyone is really interested in this topic. It's something very much that is near and dear to my heart. My mother suffered from depression. She was bipolar, schizophrenic, lots of stuff going on, and to be able to have a protocol that's so effective in conjunction with other therapies to put people in remission just makes my day, right? We're always happy to help someone heal from any crisis, but depression has been harder for most people, and they usually think of it as a lifelong sentence, when in fact it's not. Hi dear, so good to see you.
You look beautiful.
Oh, thank you. So we're going to discuss the current model, which most people are aware of. It's the theory of serotonin uptake, which is why antidepressants are prescribed, right? So SSRIs are supposed to help boost your serotonin levels or the uptake of them, and then we go into therapy and we talk about our issues and we feel better. Except for most people, that is not enough, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. What's been really exciting recently is all the research that's gone on to inflammation and how inflammation is a major cause for depression, or to keep from healing from depression. So my work, for those of you that know me, has been around the study of inflammation, specifically in the beginning of food-related inflammation, for the last 13 years. And I was talking about gut function way before most people were, and in fact, when I first started my work, everybody said I was some sort of witch doctor, and I didn't know what I was talking about. And if anybody's ever, by the way, facing this sort of scenario, if you have work that helps people, then you can always find the research that's going to back up what it is that you do. And luckily, inflammation was really in its beginning stages then. The prevailing theory at that time was that obesity caused inflammation. But what I was seeing was that healthy foods were triggering an inflammatory response, which was causing major weight gain. And when we identified and removed the foods that were causing this inflammatory response, people would lose weight, which was exciting, but it was more than just weight, because it's not a diet. It's removing what's causing inflammation for you. So that also means that we're reversing the aging process. We are putting disease in remission. And yes, we're also having a great effect on mood, depression, and anxiety. So for you folks here on Facebook, I'm going to post a very simple diagram that I've posted before, which shows the negative feedback loop when you eat a food that's inflammatory. But for my folks that are here, hello, Tara, good to see you. We're just going to briefly go over what happens when you eat a food that doesn't work for you. And really at the end of all this is what cortisol does. So when we talk about how cortisol makes you sick, how cortisol makes you fat, how cortisol makes you depressed, this is all very true. And all of my work, specifically in my last book, The Metabolism Plan, was to help you identify what triggers cortisol to rise in you. But from just a food perspective, where the plan started was you eat a healthy food and it causes an inflammatory response. Now, there is no such thing as a healthy food, and obviously my work wasn't out to identify whether fried Oreos were making you depressed and causing weight gain. What was fascinating to me were that healthy foods were eliciting this inflammatory response. So let's say you eat asparagus, which is highly inflammatory. For 85% of the population, it's going to cause an inflammatory response. The way we measure the amount of inflammation that it causes in you is that you have a histamine response. So most of us just think of a histamine response as our noses get a little stuffed, or maybe we have an eczema flare-up, or our throat gets itchy. But what winds up happening with this histamine response is that your capillaries start to leak fluid, and it shows up the next day as water weight gain. Now this is very exciting for me and for anyone that does the plan, because we can start to understand how inflammatory a food is for you by how much weight you gain in reaction to this food. So the plan and the metabolism plan are very systematic protocols that allow you to determine whether a food is healthy for you or whether it's toxic for you. So water weight gain shouldn't be a big deal, right? Water weight gain, you lose it the next day, maybe you look a little puffy, which is annoying, but it's not a big deal. What winds up happening is after you have that histamine response, this is when it starts to get super interesting, and this is when I talk about that negative feedback loop. After you have heightened levels of histamine, the next thing that happens is you have a cortisol response. Now, these heightened levels of cortisol do a few really interesting things. Heightened levels of cortisol, just like those ridiculous commercials say, it does enact long-term fat storage. So yes, you are going to have that poochy belly, right? But what it starts to do is it starts to cause a very serious chain reaction that ultimately can trigger your depression, trigger autoimmune disease, and really even serious diseases like cancer, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. So after we have this cortisol response, the next thing that happens, remember there are different pathways that might be activated more quickly than in others. But in women especially, heightened levels of cortisol does what's known as progesterone steal. So it makes us estrogen dominant. This is why one of the reasons why they're going to say when you have breast cancer is, do you have a lot of stress in your life? So when we have that progesterone steal, we have estrogen dominance. And estrogen dominance is never a great thing. In men, this is going to make them testosterone deficient. Just that, if we were just to factor that in alone, we could factor in so much depression for so many people. And I want to say, they're saying that only 60 million people suffer from depression.
Yeah.
I have a feeling the numbers are, and that's just in America, the numbers are much larger than that. Maybe they're talking chronic depression, but certainly I would think that at least a few times a week, at least with the people I'm working with, they're really working through some serious depressive episodes. So we already know that the heightened levels of cortisol are going to make you more stressed, and it's also going to cause a hormonal imbalance, right? So we have our first two, heightened levels of stress and mood. So right now we have two factors that are not being addressed in our traditional methods for treating depression. Now, after we have this hormonal imbalance, once again, these pathways might not go in this exact order in everyone, but I want to cover some of the ones that I see most quickly when somebody eats an inflammatory food. The next thing that's going to happen is that it triggers yeast. Now, everybody tends to think of yeast as a woman's issue, but everybody has yeast. Women have yeast, men have yeast, babies have yeast, everybody has yeast. And yeast is an important part of our gut function. But when it starts to become imbalanced, when yeast starts to be the boss of us, and especially when yeast starts to die down, we start to have some major mood swings. Now, yeast has a very short life cycle. For some people, it can just last 24 to 36 hours. So going back to eating healthy foods, let's say you have that egg white and asparagus omelet, and all of a sudden you trigger into depression, and then you start eating all the bad foods, and you're like, what's wrong with me? I suck. Here I am eating healthy. Once again, here I am binging. That's actually not you. I have to say, out of the tens of thousands of people we've worked with, I've never seen anyone that's an out of control eater. What I do see are people having a chemical reaction to a varying stimuli, and that triggers something else. And when you start to understand how your body responds, you can start to be more in charge. So if we know that you have a tendency to have yeast, we might say take a probiotic. We might say, if it's the stress that caused it, take SAMe, which we will cover later, to mitigate that stress response. But when we start to talk about yeast, we start to talk about some of the most interesting topics of discussion today, which is gut function, serotonin production, and depression. So serotonin we like to think of as our I'm happy hormone. It's not really a hormone transmitter, but it is produced in the gut, and they do say that up to 90% of serotonin is produced in your gut. So if you're eating a healthy food or an unhealthy food that doesn't work for your body, and an inflammatory response can last for 72 hours, you can start to see how serotonin production and uptake is not only impaired, but all of these other factors start to come in, right? I'm more stressed out, my hormones are imbalanced, I'm craving carbs because of the yeast, the extra sugar is making me nuts. Now, but I bypassed one guy right here, and this has been a big topic of discussion for me for a very long time, which is thyroid health. So we usually think of the thyroid as our master gland for our metabolism, and in fact it is. but it's also the master gland for our mood. So if one tends to be hypothyroid, there's more of a tendency to lean towards more depression. If you're hyperthyroid, there tends to be more of a lean towards anxiety. Can you be hyperthyroid and depressed, or hypothyroid and anxious? Absolutely. But this is generally the pathways that it starts to enact. So when we have the fluctuating hormones, the heightened levels of cortisol, the yeast, the sugar cravings all over the place, your thyroid becomes destabilized. And that's when we really start to see serious mood disorders. So you can start to see we're recovering right now that really isn't traditionally addressed in standard care for depression or anxiety, right? Yes, we've got the SSRIs. Yes, they can be effective. Yes, we are doing the talk therapy and the CPT and all sorts of wonderful things, and that's being effective. But if you're eating, and I think everybody here is, and if you're eating a food that doesn't work for you, and I can honestly say that every single person I've met is eating at least 3 foods, healthy foods. They're literally plugging in as part of their diet, trying to be healthier, and this is triggering inflammation, depression, weight gain, and disease. Now the exciting side benefit of finding these foods, of course we can put all this in remission, and you can start to understand why you've been battling something, why you've been trying to do the right thing and it's not working. I think the hardest thing for everyone is every person that I've met that has done the plan or has read my book really wants to be better. And when you try something and it doesn't work for your body, there comes this feeling of defeat. What's wrong with me? Therapy works for my friend. What's wrong with me? Xanax works for my friend. Why isn't it working for me? What we need to understand is, hi Logan, how are you, sweetie? Hi Alanga, oh, how nice to see you. Is that it just means that there are other things that need to be addressed and that there are more answers, and that's what's exciting. If you're being helped by these 2 standardized protocols, then that's wonderful. But the stories that I've heard, and it's what really started more of my research into depression and inflammation, was people writing to me saying, I was told I'd be on medications for the rest of my life. And now I'm off all of them. And one of them is my head nutritionist. She was told she would need to be on 5 antidepressants for the rest of her life. And literally within a few months, she was off of them. I had one woman write on Facebook, hey Taylor, that she figured out that it was potatoes and almonds that were triggering her bipolar. I mean, that is intense. And she was a vegetarian and she was eating potatoes and almonds daily. When she cut them out, she was able to regain control of her life. These are amazing stories, amazing stories. Another person who was told that she would be on antidepressants for the rest of her life, found out it was that oatmeal was triggering her depression. So when we're talking about an inflammatory response to a food, that inflammatory response can last for 72 hours, very easily, especially if you don't know the foods that immediately reset you. So when we're talking about the metabolism plan, the way that we have it set up is, first of all, based on my research, we're testing the least inflammatory foods first, right? Because you're going through a 3-day food-based cleanse. And in that 3-day food-based cleanse, you're eating what is found to be universally the least inflammatory foods. And we update our information twice a year from data we gather from all over the world. My book's been published in Korean, Portuguese, Russian, Bulgarian, Turkish, and so we take this information and we start to say, okay, what seems to work universally? That first week, we definitely call it the honeymoon period, you are rapidly losing an inflammatory response. We're seeing that thyroid meds can be cut as much by 30% in 1 week. For type 2 diabetics, we can cut insulin by as much as 50%, 50% in 1 week. We're seeing people rapidly start to remember what it feels like to be 110% you, right? And then what we slowly and systematically do is we start to introduce the foods that you eat, and we start to determine your response to that. And so if you have migraines and you introduce strawberries, which are highly inflammatory, you're not only going to have that entire negative feedback loop that we discussed, but you're also going to have those strawberries exacerbate whatever is worse for you. So if it's joint pain, you're going to have joint pain. If it's migraines, it's going to be migraines. It's constipation, it's going to be constipation. If it's depression, it's going to be depression. And really the first story, and this is, I have some friends here from back from my Harlem days when I had Neighborhood Holistic, is I was working with this wonderful mom, stay-at-home mom, and she was suffering from chronic depression, and she was, lifelong vegetarian, and we put her through the 3-day cleanse, and she was feeling amazing. She's like, Lynn, this is great. I don't believe this. I haven't felt like this in 10 years. And so on the 4th day, we introduced a new food, which was black beans. Literally within, and by the way, in those 3 days, she'd lost about 7 or 8 pounds. When we introduced the black beans, literally within minutes, she not only spiraled into a depression, but the next day when she stepped on the scale, she gained 2 pounds. Now, we're talking 100, 150 calories here, right? We were always taught that was a calorie in, calorie out. It's absolutely untrue, especially as we age. So for her, one of her major triggers was a food she was eating several times a week. And no wonder she was in a chronic state of depression. And by the way, also had 50 pounds to lose, even though she was eating healthy foods all the time. There's no such thing as healthy. It's chemistry, not calories, that gets you to your healthiest state. And that's a really important factor to remember. If something works for 99.99% of the folks I work with, and you're the 0.01 it doesn't work with, who cares about anyone else, right? So let's draw this back a little bit. Now we've discussed briefly how inflammation can start to disrupt many factors in your physiology that can trigger depression. Now let's talk about how this happens, right? Why does this happen? And why does it get worse as we get older? We start to lose roughly around 25, and there's a small loss of digestive enzymes and stomach acid and saliva, but it's not that big, right? And most of the time you might just notice that I'm a little irritable, I'm putting on a little weight, maybe I won't eat a pizza pie every night, I'll cut back, I'll eat a salad instead, and you can sort of moderate your body's responses that way. But especially for women, 35 is a really big, what I call inflammatory speed bump. 42 is another, and 50 is another. I remember it doesn't need to be those exact dates, but I really got this information from literally tens of thousands of people saying, when I was 35, this happened. When I was 42, this happened. It's amazing. Now, for some women, it's the birth of their first child. For all women, they have a big inflammatory speed bump after the birth of their second child, right? So once again, that's an extra stressor that's put on your body, and your body adapts to it by recalibrating. So when we're talking about the loss of certain functions, that's something that we need to recognize that happens. And you have to think about it. When we were hunters and gatherers, if you made it to 42, you were like the sage of the village. Like, who lived that long, right? We have to recognize that certain the processes that exist in our body, we're meant to have the long lifespan that we have. Now that doesn't mean that we are bound to be depressed and we're bound to gain weight and we're bound to get sick as we old. But if we can honor what's happening in our bodies and understand and then change our behaviors to accommodate that, we are going to have a healthier, happier life. So the idea that metabolism slows as you age is a myth. But what is true is that we do lose enzymes that when we were younger allowed us to exercise harder, eat more crappy foods, and be healthier. So as we age, we are more prone to depression. We are more prone to autoimmune disease. Once again, this is not a life sentence. When you identify the foods that work for you and the exercise that works for you and the lifestyle that works for you, you can go back to your happiest, healthiest self. In addition to the incredible success stories that we've seen with people with depression, it's also worked with autoimmune disease. And right now, and it's just right now that people are really starting to address autoimmune disease and depression, right? They're thinking, well, you have autoimmune disease, of course you're depressed, right? Instead of thinking these are holistically entwined diagnoses and symptoms that we need to be addressing. And when we address one, we address the other. So when we're talking about autoimmune disease, we're definitely talking about gut function. So this is not going to be a quick pop quiz, but if you remember, I said your gut produces up to 90% of your serotonin. Now, if you have an autoimmune disease that's caused by leaky gut and weakened gut function, of course you're also going to be more depressed. Right, so what we need to have existing a little bit more with our healthcare providers who are on our team, they are here to help us, is more of a collaboration. You want your therapist talking to your immunologist or your endocrinologist. We want to make sure that the medications that you're taking are supporting each other. Of course, we want you off medications as much as possible, but while you're on them, you want your nutritionist talking to this person, to talking to this, talking to your gynecologist, right? Talking to, your proctologist. These are all really important things, and we live in America in a healthcare system that's so divided that we're not getting the best care. So that's just an overview of what we need to do to have a better functioning capability of understanding what factors can address our depression. I do know we have some people here that have been studying that are interested in it. Let's see. Hey Gina, Boulder, Colorado, Montana. Oh yeah, Montana, if you're eating foods that are inflammatory, you're definitely going to suffer from fatigue. And of course, Montana brings up, it's good to hear from you, buddy. Montana brings up another good point, because a lot of times when we're fatigued, there's this thing, my husband's going through it right now, he's 60, he's like, I'm getting old and he's starting to feel depressed. When you eat an inflammatory food, your body's always going to divert energy from healing to digestion. And that's a super important concept to remember. And that's a biological trade-off, once again, from when we were hunters and gatherers and there wasn't a Whole Foods, right? You saw the antelope, you kill the antelope, your body rapidly assimilates the nutrients so that you can live another day. And to do that, it has to divert some energy from healing your hormones, your thyroid, your gut, right? And that's a good trade-off. But now remember, we're over the age of 35 and we start to lose some of those digestive enzymes and that stomach acid and that saliva. Now it's taking longer for us to digest that antelope, which means now it's harder for us to suffer or get rid of that depression, right? But if we identify that antelope's bad for us, then we don't go through that energy dip and our body starts to repair. Now in Montana's case, what's happening is your body diverts so much energy from healing to digestion that you're going to notice an energy dip. So when people are eating chronically foods that are inflammatory for them, their energy levels are like chronic fatigue levels. And all of a sudden, when you start eating those foods, boom, you're back up, operating at 110%, feeling like your best self. Let's see if we got, because I know we have some questions here. I'm so sorry, Allie. Yeah, autoimmune will be out of control with inflammation. So you should start to see, so there are two things when we're talking about autoimmune specifically, and it depends on how many autoimmune diseases you have. Generally, what we're going to find is that by the time people are diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, there are 2 to 3 others, which might mean that in the beginning, when you start the plan, it seems like you're inflammatory to everything. Allie, if that's what happens, don't give up. Just keep going through the plan. If you have to do it 2 times, 3 times, what's going to wind up happening is by the time you've developed an autoimmune disease, remember I said everybody's eating 3 foods that are unhealthy for them? By the time you're having an autoimmune flare, it might be 10 to 12 foods. And these are foods that you've been eating all the time, right? So your inflammatory levels are up here. So your body's like a match to the wick. It's always ready to explode negatively to the slightest stimulus. As we start to lower these inflammatory levels, you're going to find that the depression gets better and that you're not as sensitive to as many foods. So keep posting on here on Facebook. We're always happy to answer your questions. We've had a lot of people that have been in the same state: lupus, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, all sorts of diseases have had incredible results, of course, as well as depression. But let's open up the floor to some questions.
love what you said about the fact that for mental health, depression and anxiety overlaps with autoimmune and how that all comes down to the gut. And my question is, because when the immune system is so inflamed, a lot of the research that I've seen is that the protocol is an elimination diet for about at least 4 weeks to really cleanse everything, bringing the inflammation down before you start reintroducing foods. And I know that's not your plan exactly. My question is, how do you start to identify with your protocol sometimes when there's an immune reaction, many foods are just being reactive to your system because your system is just like on fire already. But once that calms down, you find the root cause of whatever it is that's triggering that immune response, and you start to heal yourself with whatever probiotics and other vitamins and nutrients that you use, digestive enzymes, that you can then maybe months down the road start to tolerate some of these things that had previously caused an immune reaction. So how does that fit in with you?
Well, so my work is actually an advanced elimination rotation diet. And what I did was I'm turning 55. 30 years ago, I started with a 3-day food-based cleanse. And it's still pretty much very similar to what we do today that I started 30 years ago. And I was doing it I opened up my health center in 2007. And we started with a 3-day food-based cleanse. And everybody responded to it really, really wonderfully. And what I started to notice was, okay, so this is the story of how the plan started. I got a BlackBerry, and that's it. I got a BlackBerry, and I was in this small neighborhood in Harlem, and people were taking the little money that they had and were investing in my little center, bringing their kids there for ballet or for karate or getting massage or acupuncture, doing yoga, or coming to me for nutrition. So, me being me, if you know me, I'd be like, oh, just email me every day, let me know how you're doing. And that's how I found out that woman reacted immediately to the black beans, even though black beans are supposed to be healthy. That's how I found immediately that somebody was reacting to salmon, or to strawberries, or to Greek yogurt, or to cauliflower, or to quinoa. All these foods that we're told we're supposed to be eating. So what I started to do is I started to gather in real time people's reactions to food, and then I started to notice, wow, 85% of people are reacting to black beans or salmon or Greek yogurt. Maybe it's not so healthy, because that's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing people have a very negative response. They're having a physiological response, and they're also having a weight gain response. And of course, that physiological response was unique to whatever was their trigger, whatever was their Achilles heel. So I developed, probably after the first 200 people that I worked with, the basics of my reactive food chart. And like I said, we do update the information about twice a year, but it really hasn't changed that much since then, which is pretty darn amazing. So what we're doing in the beginning is we are introducing, as I said in that first week, the least reactive foods. And because it's the least reactive foods, but here's the deal. If it's reactive for you, you cut it out. So I have a great story of this woman who wound up being reactive to almonds. It was something she ate every day. Now, it's something that we have on day 2 of my diet. But it's one thing that we introduce. So if you're reactive to it, you cut it out. Now, what's amazing is how quickly and rapidly the body heals. And to me, this is what makes me like an evangelist. I remember working with this guy in his 80s in Florida who had Parkinson's. And in 2 weeks, we could cut his medications by 30%. 2 weeks in his 80s. The body is truly amazing. And your body is speaking to you every single day. What I was able to develop was, and for the Lord of me, I don't know how, but I was able to develop not a diet, but a testing protocol to allow you to determine what works for you. So let's go back to your question where if we cut out the food, we can introduce this. So if you only gain 0.2 to the asparagus in Plan World, that means you only need to cut it out for 3 to 6 months, retest it and see how you do. If you gain 2 pounds and you have a huge physiological response, then that's your body saying, hey, wait a year or two. And if you gain 4 pounds, then that's probably saying, never eat this. This testing protocol works much more effectively than any sort of food testing that you're going to have. So when you're talking about food testings, one, you're talking about a lot of money. Two, you're talking about very inaccurate information. These allergy tests are 60% accurate at best. All it's showing is that you have had contact with that food before. So if you're having an IgG response or an IgE response, it just means your body has been exposed to it and that it doesn't work for you. Now, the validity of these tests are if camel showed up and you've never eaten camel and camel shows up as highly inflammatory, don't eat camel. Okay, but for the most part, when people get their blood work done, they're saying every food that I eat is on here. And so, yeah, some of it's not going to work, some of it is. But rather than thinking, and the bad thing about most of these testing protocols is they're not also going to say, hey, if it's not working for you now, it doesn't mean never. And I have to tell you, your chemistry is always in flux. My chemistry is always in flux. Fish is back in, eggs are back in, cheese is in, potatoes are in, lamb is out. It's constantly in flux. But when you have a protocol that allows you to be in charge, you're also going to be able to be in charge of your immune system and your mental health. So that's really important. But I think there was another question that I didn't address. Okay, okay, awesome. Does anyone else have any questions? I know you're new to... Oh, no. Okay. Yes?
Well, it was more of a comment, but you know, because you are so credentialed and so educated and so well trained and everything, and it's so excellent that you also respect different medical specialists as well and utilize their studies and everything. And it was just interesting to me when you talked about you've noticed with big changes in your clients at around ages 35 and 42 and around 50. But I think that you're completely validating, or the medical science is validating you, I guess maybe, that they say like every 7 years our bodies sort of change a bit. Maybe I'm not saying it quite right, but that would be 35, 42, and like 49 or 50. So it's you're right on the money with everything you're saying, and like the science back.
Saturn return.
I'm sorry?
It's your Saturn return, really.
Yeah.
So funny, it's so fair.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sarah just noticed that her DHEA is bottomed out, so that's not helping energy. Hi, Carolina. Good to see you. So yeah, with DHEA, we'd want to look a little bit more in depth. We'd want to look at pregnenolone levels first. And Sarah, I love watching you exercise, and I know you're an avid athlete, but it might be that you're exercising perhaps too much at this time. Certainly we'll see that in winter, I'll see DHEA and pregnenolone levels drop a lot, especially because people are exercising to sort of boost their serotonin. But that can also stress out your adrenals. So yeah, certainly you could supplement with DHEA, maybe 5 milligrams for a few months, or maybe just switch to something more yoga-based, and then go back to exercising more intensely when you're out there in the summer. You know, the sun's effects on our optic nerve stimulates so much that's going on in our body. It's absolutely fascinating. And before I diverge too greatly about the optic nerve, I forgot to mention the vagus nerve, which is also being discussed a lot with depression. So definitely when we're talking about gut function in the vagus nerve, which is just in its beginning infancy, that's super fascinating. So when you're talking about singing, or you're talking about chanting, or you're talking about praying, all of it should stimulate the vagus nerve and help to offset depression. That's another exciting field of research. So I guess one of the reasons, having worked so much with people, by the time, I hope, by the time people come to me, they're kind of feeling like they're at their wit's end. They're feeling like it's hopeless. They're feeling like nobody can help them. And I want to say that there are so many ways that are unique to you that are going to make you feel better. And I just want to help expand some of the possibilities that might be hampering you from being at your best weight, your best health, and your best mood. So when you're thinking about hormones, it might not be the hormone therapy that you need. It might be addressing your stress response, or eating lower inflammatory foods, or exercising a little bit less, or exercising a little bit more. Many people don't realize, even though they've seen endocrinologists, that the thyroid is really related to mood. To me, that's kind of heartbreaking, because if you know that there's a reason why, you're not broken, and there's a way you can fix it. And to be able to put people in charge of their lives and give them the tools to fix their lives is a huge benefit for me, and one of the reasons why I opened up this restaurant. Let's see, Sarah had a question? Oh, hope you're so sweet. Yeah, and Sarah said she started pregnenolone and cut the exercise way back, less cardio, more yoga. That's exactly what you need to do. We kind of live in a society where we're taught to push harder and harder and harder, and especially when you're suffering from depression, this can really cause adrenal burnout and sort of take all the fuel out of your tank. So if you do have a cool doctor, if you're feeling like everything in you is a little bit broken, I'd ask your doctor to test pregnenolone and DHEA. You want to kind of be in the mid-range for those levels. I do want to caution that if you've had breast cancer, never supplement with pregnenolone or DHEA on your own. Only do it under the guidance of a healthcare practitioner for a very short period of time, because it can feed your hormones and it can feed hormonal imbalance. So just keep an eye out on that. Hey, Sharon. Any other questions, folks? Yes.
So if you're eating an inflammatory food, say it's oatmeal, like you were saying before, does it compound, like you had it every day, or does it build on each other, or do you have to like eliminate it altogether? Maybe you eliminated something else that you thought was,
Yeah, so you bring up indirectly another great question, which is people come to me all the time. We'll use oatmeal as an example. So don't, if you eat oatmeal all the time and it's inflammatory for you, does it have a compound effect? What's interesting is when you do that 3-day food-based cleanse that we start with off the plan, and it sort of resets your body, and your body is really happy. It's like, yay, this is awesome. Thanks for loving me. I love you back. And then all of a sudden you introduce that oatmeal and it's like, whoa, hey, what are you doing? Now you're pissing me off. And so you're gonna have an immediate flare of whatever is chronic. And what's interesting, it's going to really explode in the way it affects you. So I remember there was one woman who did the plan. She wrote on Facebook, and she lost 14.4 pounds in something like 4 or 5 days. And she had a lot of inflammation to lose. And she introduced wheat, which wound up being inflammatory for her. But what was interesting was it triggered an asthmatic flare in her so bad she had to be rushed to the hospital. Now here's what's interesting, she'd never had asthma before. So when you eliminate something and you get your body to a clean state and you reintroduce that food, it talks to you louder than it's ever talked to you before. And that's why it can be so clear to people that it's not just the weight loss that's so exciting, but it's like all the things that have been bothering you, whether it's depression or it's the joint pain or whatever is flaring for you. So yes, if you eat that food all the time, Dawn, one, you're just going to notice that you're just kind of feeling like crap all the time. Like Montana's just feeling tired all the time, and maybe you just, you don't have the zest for life anymore, and kind of always operating at 50% and fighting with people you love, and all that kind of stuff. But it will start to compound and it will start to build. This is how we get type 2 diabetes. This is how we get cancer. This is how we get...
We have to start from the cleanse portion of it so that we have like a level playing field and level playing field.
Right. You have to start with those baseline foods, reduce that inflammation, and then use this systematic protocol where you slowly introduce the least inflammatory foods to the most inflammatory foods, so your body starts doing rapid healing. Right, so I would never have you taste oatmeal, which is 85% reactive, on day 4, because that would be just mean to your body, right? Here you are, all this, and it's like, So we want to introduce the foods that are least inflammatory. Now, does that mean that food might be inflammatory for you? Absolutely, there's still the risk, which is why we make sure to test a food every other day, and then the next day we have the foods that worked for you before, so we quickly mitigate that inflammatory response. So we start to slowly build the foundation of the foods that work for you. And unlike in most diets where people are saying, you know, you need to eat paleo, you need to eat vegetarian, you need to eat low carb, I don't care how you eat. I really don't. Eat whatever way you want to eat. Just make sure the foods you're eating are working for you. So whether you're eating cauliflower and you're vegan or you're paleo, and if it's reactive, cut it out. And depending on your response, bring it back in. You will find what's exciting is that most of the time it's through overuse of foods, eating a food too often because we're very systematic eaters, that we start to build up those food sensitivities. But when you take those foods out, your body's going to quickly heal and you're going to go back to feeling 100% you. Yes?
Why was cow milk? Like I eat goat cheese, Manchego, but give me like an ounce of anything to do with like cow's milk, and I have a reaction. What's the difference between
It's so common. The molecules of cow's milk are much harder to do. This brings up so many fascinating things. So you might notice in France that it might be easier for you to digest cow's milk. You might notice if you were to have raw cow's milk, it would be easier to digest. Part of it has to do with the pasteurization. So the same way that you don't want to cook an oil beyond its set point when it starts to smoke, right? You know that's bad. In America, we pasteurize our milk too quickly and at too high of a temperature. And we actually had a dairy farmer weigh in on Facebook and say, I think the normal pasteurization is 165, and I think they did 155. And people that said that they had lactose issues could totally eat their cheese, which is super, super cool. But sheep's cheese and goat's cheese, the molecules are much smaller and easier to digest. The same with buffalo milk, right? Much easier to digest. But a lot of it is also based on genetics. So for instance, 17%, let's say, Northern Europeans had to adapt to digesting cow's cheese because it was a big protein source for them, right? Whereas people of African and Asian descent did not. So people of African and Asian descent will also often have, don't have the enzymes to break down the lactose, right? So some of it is based on genetics, some of it is based on the way we process foods, and sometimes food just doesn't work. Great question. Children's anxiety and depression, yeah, it can definitely be food-based, and many of you may know my stepdaughter is autistic, bipolar, schizophrenic, and definitely food was a huge issue for her, and seeing her triggers. Too often when we see a pediatrician, they're going to go for the normal stuff, cut out the dairy, cut out the gluten, when that may not be the issue. It may be. There are many things that are in our healthy foods, like there's a Dianato, and we always see it in those Amy's little bunnies or whatever. Triggers major ADHD, major anxiety. So there's so many factors that are affecting our kids. Food is part of it, for sure. Not being able to be outside and play is a huge part of it. The additives that are in it, the xenoestrogens that everybody's exposed to, the pesticides, the nonstick pans. There was a great study that was done in Berkeley with 100 Latina girls, Latina teens, and they did a measure of their blood with the hair care products and skin products that they were using, and many of them contained parabens and things that we're talking about now. And then they just took them out and gave them clean products for just 3 days, and all of those levels dropped by 50%. So many of these things that we're putting in, these endocrine disruptors, which affect our hormones, are huge factors. The same thing, the pesticides that we eat, if your kid, even if it's a healthy school lunch, I'm not saying that we need to eat organic, but these pesticides are endocrine disruptors. They're disrupting hormones, which is why girls are getting their cycle when they're 9 and 10. There's a lot we need to address. Can you address a lot with food and identifying and removing reactive foods? Yeah, for sure. For Ella, it was Her dad thought he was doing the healthy thing by giving her a lot of Trader Joe's healthy prepared foods, which tend to be super high in sodium. Whenever you have high sodium foods, it makes you crave high carbohydrate and high sugar foods. So for her, high sodium was a trigger to her anger, and then she would crave the carbs, and then that would trigger her bipolar. So that's something to look out for. There's a great website that I like called Hey Sigmund, and they address children. It's a UK website. They address children and anxiety a lot, and a great way to talk about the amygdala, which is really fascinating. For anxiety for kids, I'm a big fan of lemon balm. Of course, this is something you'd want to talk about with your pediatrician, but it's something that I used with my son, Braden. Lemon balm is an herb that's in the mint family. You can grow your own. It grows like a weed, just like mint does, and you can make a simple tea out of it. And that, if you read reviews on Amazon, it's what's used to wean people off of Xanax and Paxil, so it's super, super effective. So definitely look into that. Braden was suffering from anxiety from probably 5 till about 9, and we would use lemon balm as needed and talk therapy and finding the foods that work for him, and he was able to grow out of it. But it's tough to see your kids suffer. It really is. Yes?
I'm not sure if you're going to get to this or you've already spoken about it, but are there certain foods that you do recommend across the board for people with depression?
Well, across the board for depression, well, it's more about relieving inflammation. So really those first 5 days of the plan have the least inflammatory foods. And even on day 6, you might be able to skirt by with your first protein test. That's what's going to help with the depression. There's no universal food to relieve depression. There are, as one is titrating down from medications or working through depression and finding the foods that work for them, there are certain things that I recommend, like the SAMe. So if you tend to have more anxiety, that would be something to look at. And by the way, for you folks that are on thyroid medications, because you do become over-medicated so quickly on the plan, you need to cut your medications quickly. So I'm working with somebody in Chicago right now, and by day 5, she started to notice, I can't sleep, I'm having anxiety, what's going on? And so I said, well, your BBT, and for you folks that are planners, you know what BBT means. I said, your BBT's been really high. We cut, by day 5, we were able to cut her medication by half. And she was sleeping through the night and anxiety was gone. So that's I think many of us aren't used to how rapidly our bodies can heal and how exciting that is. But that does mean also that if you're on medication, you're going to want to talk to whoever's prescribing your SSRIs. You might need that cut, right? So it's a game changer to be in charge of your chemistry, and that's what I'm doing. I wish I could say that there was something universally. So aside from the lemon balm, which I love, SAMe is great. So what we're always trying to do when you're planning, as we call it, is to mitigate the effects of cortisol. Identify and remove what's causing stress, but you're still going to have that stressor, right? So it might be the deadline at work, it might be the over-exercise, it might be eating the cauliflower. So what you can do is you can take SAMe, and for most people 600 milligrams works really well, taken all at once. And what that does is it helps to boost the uptake of serotonin or dopamine, whichever you're weaker in, and it totally just shunts that effect. It's like, yeah, it's stress, but I'm not bothered by it. Yeah, that kind of sucks, but you know, whatever. Instead of you freaking out. And what winds up happening is, as we start taking what I call your internal stress levels, but as we start taking it from here to here, you're going to need the SAMe less. You're going to need the lemon balm. You're going to need stuff less. You're going to all of a sudden notice, wow, I didn't take SAMe today and I wasn't stressed and I still dealt with that jerk at work, you know? That's what's happening is we're improving your response to stimuli.
So you take that on an as-needed basis?
On an as-needed basis, which always brings up the question, I think I need it every day, right?
I'll
And
tell you that I'm not really a supplement taker, and most stuff doesn't work, or I never been able to either get weight long enough, whatever it is, the SAMe works.
I take it almost every day. But you know it works.
It works.
it works.
You can honestly feel the difference.
Wow.
And the reason why I like recommending that you take it on an as-needed basis, because what's going to happen, rather than saying take it every morning, you know, we get into habits and we just keep taking something for forever.
Are you going to
If
react to it?
No, I haven't seen anyone react to it, but If you only take it when you need it, all of a sudden you're gonna stop taking it because you're not gonna be stressed one day. And a couple of days go by. And literally that's what happens with my clients. They'll be like, holy smoke, I didn't take SAMe for 3 days. Like I was taking it every day for a week. And that's what's exciting, because it's great to have a medication that works. It's great to have a supplement that works. But it's even better to feel like you don't need something. And that's 99.99% of the people I work with don't want to take anything and want to start to feel like they're in charge and take it when they need it. Once again, that's what planning's all about. So you need to take it every day, but only take it when you need it. By the way, SAMe is also great because it's great for people at higher risk of Alzheimer's. It's great for cognitive function. It's a mild liver detoxifier. It helps to boost collagen. So it's pretty darn good stuff.
But if you're already taking an SSRI,
yeah, that's fine. Now, of course, you always want to check with your doctor. But I've been with people that are on like 450 milligrams of Wellbutrin and 300 of something else and something else. There's never been an issue. I did have one doctor say that they were worried that they might have some serotonin storm, but I've never seen it. But
yeah,
discuss with your doctor always.
Yeah,
we haven't seen it.
Yeah, like my dad has dementia. He's taking prepropofol something.
Right.
No, but the SAMe would be nice.
The SAMe would be nice. How's his mood?
He's in a really great mood most of the time, but they switched his medication because he was putting on so much weight. And now he's sleeping all the time, which is terrible.
That is terrible.
Yeah.
To ask him if they can cut the meds. He shouldn't be sleeping all the time.
I know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Let me see, do you have anybody asking anything on here? Yeah, hormones are so important, Sarah. Hot flash help. For a hot flash, so you're going to notice the days that you're stressed out, you're going to have more hot flashes, so that's where SAMe comes in hand. You're also going to notice the days that you exercise after 5 p.m. can be a real hot flash instigator. What winds up happening is when you do that, you disrupt the circadian rhythm of how your body's supposed to go. So remember, back to when we were hunters and gatherers, before there was TV and electricity, we would go to sleep when the sun set, and we certainly wouldn't be going to a spinning class. So what would wind up happening is you'd hang out with your tribe and you'd have your dinner and then you'd go to bed and then you'd sleep. So what winds up happening is if you're doing that Zumba class or the hot yoga, the only reason you would get up in the middle of the night to do something that active would be to outrun a lion or something like that, right? So what it's doing is it's triggering this cortisol spike, which disrupts your sleep. So for hot flash, once again, identifying and removing inflammatory foods, because that's going to balance your hormones. Taking SAMe when stressed, because heightened levels of cortisol are always going to cause hot flashes for sure. Finding the exercise that works for your body, not overdoing it, but not underdoing it as well. Oh, and also, sage has worked very well. Sage tea and sage essential oils. A lot of women have said putting it in their baths helps them a lot as well. And let's see where we are time-wise. We've got a couple of more minutes. Noor, what's going on? Okay, so Noor says, when she's on track, it's good with the plan, but you can't control your eatings and cravings. Hormones and stress, huge factor. So, one of my favorite things, if you're doing the plan and if you find that that's not enough, and if you're doing the SAMe and you find that that's not enough, one of my favorite tools for hormonal balance would be one, acupuncture, super awesome. For a lot of people, cost can be a factor, but a lot of acupuncture schools will allow you to work with their students ready to graduate, and that would only be $20 to $25 a session. There are some wonderful herbs like chaste tree and dim. One of my favorite compounds is known as FemGuard by Designs for Health. That really helps to balance your hormones, because for most women, we're estrogen dominant, and that helps to balance us off to be a little more progesterone balanced. And if you needed to discuss this with your gynecologist, and if you needed some hormonal help for a while, do that. But if you are on HRT or if you are on hormones and you're planning, the issue might be that you're over-medicated, and that's when we start to run into issues. So it's really good to have a team behind you as you go through this journey of lowering inflammation, and have your medical team know that your medications are going to need to be cut, and they need to be on it, and they need to listen to your symptoms. All right, everyone, thank you so much for showing up. Next week we have Dee Cohen speaking. She's speaking how to preserve yourself in a Me Too world. She's a relationship and marriage expert. After that, we have Gemma Jaw speaking. She's going to be talking about life transformation, especially for spring, how to get your mojo back. We have somebody else speaking about transformation and healing at the end of the month. Next month, we have one of New York City's top plastic surgeons speak. He's talking about a non-invasive thread lifting method. So for those of you like me who are turning 55 and wondering what you're going to do, he's going to discuss some alternatives to fillers, which don't work for a lot of people and which need a lot of upkeep and uptake. Remember, we're always here to speak about your financial, your physical, your physiological, and your emotional health. So if you know of anybody that would like to speak, we'd love to have them here. Everyone here on Facebook. Lastly, I just wanted to do some coronavirus updates because we've been discussing this a lot. The initial information that we got has not changed, and that we want to protect lung health. So anybody that is suffering from any sort of lung dysfunction, whether it's acid reflux, whether it's asthma, whether it's chronic bronchitis, you need to get on some lung healing herbs. Slippery elm is one of my favorites. You can get slippery elm lozenges. We've discussed zinc lozenges. Yeah, it does taste really bad. Zinc lozenges work wonders. Osha, which is a Native American herb, also works wonders. You might want to consider taking vitamin A. Vitamin A is a wonderful antiviral. You would never want to take vitamin A for an extended period of time, but as we're in this crisis mode, you would want to take that.
What about D?
Vitamin D is good, but I wouldn't think it's specifically for this protocol. We're talking specifically for coronavirus. Elderberry, wonderful, wonderful. We've been talking about NRF1 and NRF2 for mitochondrial response. So for anybody that hasn't read the post on Facebook or my fan page, read that. There's a lot of stuff that we can do, but the first, besides washing our hands, which everybody's drilling in, which is great, is protecting your lungs. And that's why taking zinc capsules is great, but when you take the zinc lozenge or the slippery elm, what it really does is it protects the mucosa. It acts like a barrier so that external allergens can't latch onto the mucosa and start to breed and start to break through. Okay? So thank you guys. Wonderful chatting with you. Hope to see you next week. Keep the questions coming. I'll be answering them tomorrow and the next day on Facebook. Have a great night, guys.